duplicate. So the question says, given an integer of array of numbers, return true if any value appears at least twice in the array, and return false if every element is distinct. Okay, so and when you look at the question, this one is quite easy, right? So it's basically saying, if we have a duplicate, so for instance, in this case where we have like 1, 2, 3, if we find one again, we know we have a duplicate, right? So in that case, we'll return true, right? Then this is basically the explanation. Then we have the example 2. This will return false because there are no duplicates. Then I don't think we need example 3. And I also take out the explanations because we kind of understand them without the explanations. We just need only 2 examples. The reason I'm doing this is I'll be able to have enough space on my screen. I'll also delete, and also I don't know if I don't need this. So I'll split this into 2 and I'll add. All right. So this is our this is what we have, right? So this is the question. We are given an integer that contains, we are given an array that contains integers. So we're supposed to return true if any value appears at least twice in the array, and we're supposed to return false if that is not the case. So the first way to think about this is there are 2 ways you can solve this. You can go, there's the brute force way, which you can ultimately suggest maybe an interview or something, where we can say, okay, would sort the array. And the moment we start talking about like sorting the array, we already, there's already an overhead there, right? So we can say we'll sort the array, and after sorting the array, we'll now like have double nested for loops, where, so for instance, how that will work is, let's say we have like this particular guy. So we have this particular guy, right? So if we are using the double nested loop format, what that will mean is would have the first loop would check for the first element, while the second loop will run through the rest of the element to look for duplicates, right? So what that means is, when we are at, let's say, the index of I, the nested for loop will then be at the index of I plus 1, right? So the inner for loop would run through the the integers in the array. So it will run through 2, 3, and 1, looking for a duplicate, something like that. So we could do that, or we could go with a more efficient solution. And this will now take us back to set theory. This is something I can find in other languages, like let's say JavaScript, but in Rust we have something we call HashSet, right? So how I would solve this is, first of all, I will not solve the brute force style or the brute force way, because we don't have enough. I'll just go ahead and solve the optimal solution. But ideally, I think the best way to go about this is, if you find yourself in an interview, you should always talk about the brute force if you know how to solve the brute force, and then come up with an optimized. For this, we are going to solve it using sets, right? And I think most of the problems I might be having in this one might come from the Rust mechanics, getting the right syntax and stuff like that. But I think I've already spoken too much, so let me just go ahead and start writing the code. So the first thing I'm going to do is, in the Rust, what's it called? In the Rust standard library, we have something we call HashSet. So the way we get HashSet is to say use std. So std stands for standard library. So we'll get into collections. So collections, and then in that place we'll go for HashSet, right? So that's basically it, right? So that's like everything we need. So the next thing we are going to do now is to go ahead and first of all, we'll create a function. This is how I like to do mine. So I'll say function, I'll call it contains duplicates. So guys, please feel free to drop a comment. If you have any questions you want to ask, go ahead and ask and all that. But then I'll just say contains dupe. Don't even write too much. So what does this guy take? So first of all, here I would just get this and I'll initialize it in my main function. Say let's or let me just call it array equals to this. So I'm going to be passing it into dupe. All right, so like I said, we're using HashSet for this, so I'm passing the array into this function. So this function now accepts, is expecting something. So I'll say nums, and it's because in Rust you have to define everything that you have to specify the type of everything that you're passing into a function. All right, just like how TypeScript works, JavaScript and all that. Right, Rust is very strict with that. So this is a vector of integer. So it's going to be vec, and it's going to take an I32, right? So the question says we are going to be returning true or false. So in Rust, the function sometimes has to define what it is returning. So in that case, here we'll be returning a boolean. So we'll call it a bool, and that's basically it, right? So now, since we are using a hash set, we'll go ahead and okay. So I think I've not explained how hash sets work. So basically, sets they take only unique characters. So when you try to send a duplicate character into that set, it automatically bounces it off and tells you that there is an error and stuff like that. So that's why I'm using sets basically, right? So now I'll go ahead and say I'll call it scene equals to I'll initialize the sets. I'll say hash set new. Okay, so now that I've initialized my set, and I have to go ahead and look through the elements in my array, that is the integers in my array. So for that, it's very simple in Rust. So say for num in nums, right? That's basically it, right? So what I want to do is I want to say if I have not seen a particular value, I want to return true. Else, at the end of everything, I just want to return, let's do this dot seen dot insert. So if I've not seen, so I want to say insert nums itself. Okay. Insert num if I want to return true. Else, outside of this, I just want to return false. So this particular, if I run this code, it's going to break. I'm sure it's going to break. I've already seen like some issues here and there. One of the issues is the fact that whenever you're modifying something like this, like for instance the hash sets, we have to tell us that okay, this is going to be something that's going to be mutable, right? So we have to say okay, this is going to be mutable, so we're adding a mute keyword there, right? This is something I've not added just for the purpose of learning and teaching and stuff like that, right? So this is something I've not added. But for now, I'll just go ahead and run this code and see what happens. So want it. Okay. So okay, contains duplicates. So mismatch type, we're expecting. So it contains. So here we're basically saying let's value contains duplicates. Okay. Nah, that's not it. So line 33. Oh, I see. So the issue here is I forgot to make this a vec. So this is how you make a vec in Rust, an array in Rust, right? It's like something like this, or you can do like the vec.new and all that blah 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 stuff like that. But yeah, that's why we are having that first error. Okay, that could be the reason. Cannot borrow as a mutable. Exactly. So this is what I was talking about. Cannot borrow as a mutable. So it goes ahead to say I should add the mute keyword. This is what I was talking about. So I will just go ahead and resolve those two issues. and I'll run this again. So run exactly, right? So now you can now see that, this automatically, gives us through. So if we do something like 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we run this again, it gives us false. So this works as possible to cover all 4 of them. So we've done contains duplicate. So say done. So basically what we just did here was, it was very simple, right? Um, I talked about the brute force, but then I went ahead to use the, what's it called? The hash sets pattern, right? To solve this. So now that we've solved this, I will just go ahead and